This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Starting off, John from Los Angeles, along with others, asks, I'm sure you, just as many of us, are saddened by the passing of the renowned evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers. I was wondering if you could tell us about some of Trivers' greatest hits and whether or not you knew him personally.
Robert Trivers, enormously impactful, fairly controversial individual. He died last month at age 83, and the argument could be made that he's the single most important figure in thinking about the evolution of behavior. And this is mostly due to a miraculous meteoric 4-year period he had in the early 1970s. Okay, to review some material we've touched on before, way back when in the dark ages, up before the 1960s or so, everybody's thinking about the evolution of behavior was completely out of whack because it was dominated by this one soundbite. Animals behave for the good of the species. Animals are self-sacrificial for the good of the species. Everybody was taught this. And this was undone in the late 1960s by probably the only equal to Trivers in terms of contribution, British zoologist, theoretical biologist W.D. Hamilton, who famously destroyed this first type of thought: animals behave for the good of the species, what would be referred to as group selection. Evolutionary selection for behavior is on the level of what's good for the group, what's good for the species. And what Hamilton showed in a classic, brilliant paper that's been cited like 25,000 times was the mathematics of showing no, that's not how it works. Animals behave for the good of their own reproductive success, for the good of leaving as many copies of genes as possible in the next generation, and showing emphatically all the cases where people thought they were seeing animals behaving for the good of the species. That's not what was actually going on if you looked more closely. So Hamilton ushered in this whole world of the selfish gene, individual selection. Behavior has evolved to optimize the number of copies of genes somebody leaves in the next generation. Now, what Trivers then did, coming on the scene, his first landmark paper, 1971, was showing, well, you can optimize leaving copies of your genes in a number of different ways. One of them is to reproduce as much as possible and directly individual selection, leave copies of your own genes as much as possible. And another way of doing it is to help close relatives who share a lot of genes with you, helping them to reproduce more. And the logic behind this kin selection, something we've gone over, is if you have a full sibling who thus shares 50% of their genes with you on the average, you can either optimize your passing on copies of genes to future generations by reproducing once, or by expending the same effort, helping your full sibling to reproduce twice. One times 100%, two times 50%, the exact same impact evolutionarily. Thus, bringing in this whole concept, this foundational concept, that a lot of what animals do is cooperate with close relatives. What Trivers showed in his 1971 paper, which was one that just blew everyone away, mammothly cited, influential, was the evolution of reciprocal altruism. The observation that in all sorts of social species, animals cooperate. Animals work with each other, with individuals who are not their relatives. And what Trivers worked out was essentially the mathematics, the econometrics of why it could be very adaptive to have organisms cooperate. Many hands make the task light among non-relatives under very specific constraints, basically built around you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, I'll cooperate with you if I have a high likelihood of being able to be reciprocated, that at some point in the future, you are going to scratch my back and back, that we can help each other, reciprocal altruism. And what he showed was under circumstances where you're in a species that's social, in stable social groups. So you help this individual today, and there's a pretty good chance they'll help you next Tuesday. They're going to stick around under circumstances where you're smart enough to remember who the individuals are and to keep track of interactions. You can have selection for cooperation. And this was enormously important because, in principle, as soon as you back away from animals or behaving for the good of the species, instead, nature, bloody in tooth and claw, what you have is it never makes sense to cooperate with non relatives. And instead, what he showed were the specialized circumstances where cooperation between non relatives could actually be selected for stable reciprocity. And what he introduced, probably is the most important concept in there, is yes, yes, it could be highly adaptive for you to cooperate with a reciprocating partner, symmetrical, but even better would be circumstances where they cooperate with you, but you stab them in the back, you cheat, you don't reciprocate, and thus leading in an entire world of the evolution of cheating, the evolution of surveillance for cheating, and complex game theory strategies for when it makes sense to cooperate, when it makes sense to cheat, when it makes sense to invest X amount of energy in being on guard against cheaters. So that was his 1971 paper, monumental. Then, a mere year later, he came out with this next of his miraculous quartet of papers. And what this one was looking at was another domain where people used to think there was nice cooperation, mating pairs. And instead, the analysis that Trivers went through, again, a very rigorous mathematical one, was the two individuals in a mating pair don't have the same incentives for leaving copies of genes because each one of them is only going to be related 50% to the offspring, and there's differential costs. This was taking into account that in most species, females carry a bigger cost of reproduction. They make eggs. Eggs are more expensive than sperm. They have pregnancies. They've got to carry through with that. In mammals, you got the cost of nursing. And what you have is basically a debit against the female and the male of how much have they invested in this passing on copies of genes, and where do you see the greatest asymmetries between the two? And what that tells you is things work differently in species that have external fertilization because the female is not carrying on the pregnancy. Things work differently in non-mammals where you don't have nursing. Things work differently in species, seahorses, for example, where the males do the bulk of the parenting behavior, carry the bulk of the cost of it. And what he worked out was a generalized model that essentially said at points where you see the biggest discrepancy between how much you have spent on this reproduction and the other individual in the pair has done, when there's the biggest discrepancy, when they have spent the most more than you have, that's the time to cheat. That's the time to abandon the kid. That's the time to leave them holding the bag. And this was a whole sort of exploration of circumstances in which couplings were more or less stable. Basically, the evolutionary mathematics of why sometimes organisms evolved pair bonds and sometimes not. And why sometimes those pair bonds were not only socially monogamous, but sexually monogamous as well, and sometimes not. Okay, so sitting up after that, he rested a bit, and the next year he came out with an incredibly original paper with the evolutionary biologist Dan Willard. Those of you who have long intact memories will recall many, many episodes ago, we talked about the Trivers Willard sex ratio paper and the predictions it made as to when there would be a skew in a population towards giving birth to females, one towards males. The Trivers Willard calculations of Do you want to give birth to a daughter or a son? Wait, that's a weird way of phrasing this, but beginning to look at a simple fact: who's more expensive to have? Who's a safer bet? Who's a bigger gamble for passing on copies of your genes by way of your offspring? And much of this thinking was built around the fact that in mammalian species, a female will give birth, I don't know, 5, 10 offspring over the course of her lifetime, 5 to 10 costly pregnancies, 5 to 10 costly periods of nursing, that this is the sort of trajectory of basically maximal reproductive success for a female. Meanwhile, in males, you got a boom or bust strategy of you can have species in which most of the males never reproduce and a tiny subset foster hundreds of offspring or so. An example of this: elephant seals. 95% of elephant seal males never reproduce. 5% of them account for like 99% of the reproduction. And thus the question becomes, you were about to get pregnant. Which would you rather have? When is it a good strategy to gamble on a male offspring? When is it good to be more conservative and go for a female? Working out the mathematics of that. And what they showed was, in a species where you had dominance ranks, maybe being high ranking female, you pass on your high rank to your daughter. In that case, invest in a daughter, bias your reproductive physiology towards having a daughter. On the other hand, maybe when times are tough and the dominance hierarchy is very much oriented towards males, that's a good time to have a male if you think you're likely to have a high ranking offspring. Then, on the other hand, at times when ecologically there's some miserable period, having a daughter is a safer investment, and that's the word that they used, than having a male, because the male is more of a gamble. Going through all of this, working out the mathematics of when does it make sense to have a daughter? When does it make sense to have a male? Okay, that's great. That left everybody with this great theorizing. You don't choose which offspring, what sex your kid is, but what you then saw was, in this famed Trivers Willard sex ratio, what circumstances push for more males being born, more females being born, and what's the driving force on that physiologically? Males are more expensive fetuses than are females. So when times are tough, you are more likely, while starving, to miscarry a male. When times are tough, you have a skew towards more females being born than males. When times are great, more males than females. If you're high ranking and you've got all sorts of food advantages, skew towards having male offspring. If you're high ranking female and your daughter is going to inherit a high rank, maybe skew towards having females. A whole world where physiology of pregnancy perfectly matched what these models were generated by this paper. So that was number three. And then the fourth of Trivers' miraculous quartet of papers came the next year in 1974. And this was another one that upended Hallmark card conventional thinking. Mothers and offspring, they love each other and they're bonded and they share the same evolutionary incentives. And as soon as you start doing the math of genetics, you realize they don't, because a mother only shares 50% of her genes with her offspring. And thus, the fourth paper, The Evolution of Parent Offspring Conflict, was built on this completely counterintuitive thing that mothers and offsprings are going to disagree at times as to how much the mother should be investing in the well being of the offspring. And what is this beginning to explain? This would play out in terms of parent offspring conflict over weaning. We, in fact, made mention to this a few weeks ago when talking about Punch the monkey and Punch abandoned by his mother and horrifying bad press for the mother. And when watching the interactions, a lot of it resembled kind of premature mother offspring conflict over weaning. Mom wants to stop nursing the kid because the kid is big enough now, enough spending energy, spending calories, spending reproductive potential on making milk when instead you could stop nursing and soon be ovulating and have another kid. Meanwhile, the kid's incentive is to mooch off of mom for as long as possible. And thus, baby primates, when they're being weaned, throw these tantrums like they're being murdered by their mother who's pushing them away. This was working out the mathematics of when is it in the mother's best interest to continue nursing versus weaning? When is it in the kid's best interest to put up a huge fight to continue weaning? When is it to the mother's advantage to try to block infanticide against her infant, weighing the benefits of saving the kid against is she willing to get badly injured in terms of her future reproductive success? When does it make sense to abandon an offspring? Going through again the math of this is a very strategically evolved set of decisions on the part of mothers and offsprings in every single species out there. So this was this astonishing quartet of papers equivalent to Einstein's four papers in 1905, his Annus Mirabilis, his miraculous year. This was a miraculous 4 years for Trivers, 4 successive years, producing this huge body of all the theoretical predictions that should come out about aspects of the evolution of behavior. And what turned out to be the case is these were enormously explanatory models. They are the backbone of how people think about the evolution of behavior. And for the most part, I'm being a little bit overly extreme here, but for the most part, that's the last foundational work that Trivers did. He was about 33 years old at the end of his quartet, and most of the rest of his career for the subsequent half century was minor elaborations, some interesting side shunts. Probably his most interesting thing in the years afterward was his working out models for the evolution of self-deception. What's interesting about that? What he focused on was the world of strategic interactions back to reciprocal altruism and cheating and surveillance against it and getting away with it. The fact that one of the best ways to deceive another organism is if you believe your own deceits themselves, the advantages of self-deception. So he did some work on this over the subsequent decades. What he is mostly going to be in the textbooks for millennia to come were those four papers over a 4 year period outlining everything about the evolution of competition and cooperation between organisms that are only partially related. Now, you'll note that in my talking about this, I keep using these very economic terms, investment, and when does it make more sense to invest a careful investment in a daughter versus more of a gamble in a male? This was not by chance. What we're showing here is one of the figures from one of his four papers, and they were all full of figures like this. These were econometric models that would have delighted any quantitative economist out there, showing exactly in this male female pair who had invested how many calories at this point, how much of a discrepancy, when was the optimal point to abandon your mate, when was the optimal point to wean your offspring. These were very mathematically rigorous models that he generated. So this was Trivers and his contribution. What this leads us to now is Trivers as a person. And this is interesting because he was one of the most notoriously difficult, unstable people to ever set foot in the realm of evolutionary biology. As the New York Times said after his death, his obituary, he had enormous intellectual highs and enormous behavioral lows. He was basically a very damaged individual and thus was very damaging to those around him. He had lifelong major serious challenges with bipolar disorder. And this began in college, some extended periods of hospitalization that went through the rest of his life. And his bipolar disorder was not well controlled. How much of this is due to the fact that he may very well not have been following his medication regimes? That could be part of it. The other was a seemingly endless appetite he had for recreational drug use of some fairly extreme types. So he was struggling with this his entire life. In terms of his academic trajectory, the first paper was in his final year as a grad student at Harvard. The next three were his first 3 years as a professor at Harvard. And in the aftermath, buoyed by the success of this, he demanded that Harvard tenure him way early, and because of how hidebound they were, and frankly, because of his history of psychiatric instability, they turned him down for tenure. He then spent a couple of decades at University of California, Santa Cruz, then a couple of decades at Rutgers University, and in every case, burning bridges left and right. The aftermath, volatile personality, volatile temper, literally, not just figuratively, literally circumstances of physical altercations with people, and a very atypical academic trajectory thereafter. Some of his fieldwork was some sort of reptile or amphibian that lived in Jamaica. He spent decades basically living in Jamaica. He had multiple families there with multiple Jamaican wives over the years. Along the way, as a very colorful detail, he became very close friends with Huey Newton. Huey Newton, one of the founders in the 1960s of the Black Panthers. And Newton and Trivers collaborated together on one paper, and eventually, Trivers himself joined the Black Panther Party, the only white guy in it. A very unstable, a very colorful character, very unstable in another realm as well. During the time that I was in his orbit, I was an undergrad, he was just a junior faculty. I knew from secondhand accounts that he would not have survived the contemporary Me Too period in terms of his predatory behavior with female undergraduates. Very late in his life, he very notoriously defended Jeffrey Epstein with outrageous statements to the effect that, eh, pedophilia, no big deal. Why is everyone making such a big fuss about it? He was very unstable, very unpredictable, often very cruel, damaging individual who had 4 years of sheer incandescent brilliance. One of those, what do you make of the discrepancy between what somebody has produced and the person who he is, the Ezra Pound scenario? In terms of my personal exposure to him, we had a couple of totally cordial email exchanges in recent decades about some points or other. However, I was witness to him on a weekly basis throughout college. I came to Harvard to be a bioanthropology major, which was his department. This was the department that sociobiology was being born in the 1970s. One of the senior figures in the department, a guy named Irvin DeVore, whose feet I sat at, had every Wednesday night this thing called Simian Seminar in his living room, where all the people in the department with any interests in these areas would sit there and argue all these theoretical models about the evolution of behavior. And I was a lowly undergrad there starting in my freshman year. I was about as peripheral as possible. And Trivers was on the scene, and most straightforwardly, he scared the crap out of me because he was silent and sullen and pacing around the back and totally unpredictable. And apparently, what would happen is after the meetings were done, he and the other senior most old boys would sit down there and get roaring drunk and invent sociobiology. And that was when Trivers was pioneering those four papers. So I was way too junior and way too meek and way too intimidated to have any interactions with him. But just observing him at a distance, he was a pretty unstable, scary guy. Monumental contributions, nonetheless.
Next, Tamam from Syria asks, why is it that when you are on an edge somewhere up high, there is a desire to jump, like an internal compulsion to throw yourself?
Well, what we see is something remarkably common, and it even has a name for the phenomenon, call of the void. And best of all, it actually originally had a French name, l'appel du vide, the pull, the call of the void, that empty space. And as implied in the question, one of the most reliable versions of it is you're up on some high precipice and all you're thinking is, what if I jumped off now? Another common version of it is you've got a train coming, and you're thinking, what if I jumped in front of the train right now? Or you're driving and thinking, why don't I just suddenly swerve into oncoming traffic? And most people, when they learn that this is recognized enough to be a phenomenon that's been studied, it's, oh my God, I thought I was the only person doing that. It's like the first time you discover other people get little floaters across their eyes. Yes, turns out about half of people have these call of the void sensations. Now, it's been studied enough that there's two different psychological batteries that examine it. The first one, I'm not sure how useful it is because essentially they ask the person, well, how often are you in a high place where you feel an urge to jump off? Okay, how often do you feel like swerving your car into oncoming traffic? How often do you feel like jumping in front of trains? And if the answer is a lot of the time, the conclusion is you got a lot of call of the void going on there. The more recent questionnaire has two additional ones. In addition, how frequently you're having any of these urges. The fourth question is, how ego dystonic does it feel to you? How much does this impulse, this urge, contradict everything you are about? What am I doing? What am I thinking? I would like turn my car into oncoming traffic. That's like, whoa, not only this urge, but the complete alienness of it, dissonant with who you are. And out of that literature comes two interesting findings. When you get people where it is so dissonant that they are just unable to function because of these thoughts, these obsessions, this is often a marker of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And the other one is amid saying, no, these people are not suicidal, feeling an urge to jump in front of a train or jump off a building. If somebody is not at all ego dystonic and feeling this, if that feels just right to them, this is someone who is probably having a lot of suicidal ideations. The fifth question is, how much do you activate protective behaviors to make sure you don't actually do it? Do you step back from the edge? Do you reframe in your head about how you're really not feeling it? So lots of these urges, it doesn't fit who you are, and it makes you uncomfortable enough that you back up a bit, and this is having this lapel du vide. So once those studies are carried out, what it shows is about 50% of people have them at some point or other. You see particularly high rates of them in individuals with anxiety disorder, with neuroticism. My own experiences with call of the void are a little bit complicated. I've never seriously had the urge to swerve the car into oncoming traffic because being a New Yorker, I'm frightened enough while driving that I'm going to accidentally do that. That never lures as an issue. And any New Yorker will know, in terms of the fear of jumping in front of a train, what you spend all your time doing on a platform in the subway station is, what would I do if somebody pushed me in front of the train right now? And I would roll into a cubbyhole, I would leap back up, I would flatten my, so those. But in terms of feeling the call of the void from a high space, I felt that once in an amazing circumstance. This was in Kenya. I climbed up this beautiful volcano called Mount Longonot, and you really don't have a clue it's a volcano until you get right over the top. And there's this amazing thing there. And I was so blown away with like awe and gratitude that the universe can produce something like this, that it seemed like the only logical thing to do at that point was to leap into the volcano. So I'm not sure if that was a classic case of lapel du vide. By the way, I was also very intrigued, amused, something to find Joseph Thomson, Scottish explorer in the 19th century, had the exact same experience, that he had come through East Africa and probably was the first European to climb up to the top of this Mount Longonot, where in his Victorian prose, he said, so magnificent was seeing God's work in this volcano that it seemed there could be no other action at that point other than to fling myself into it. The exact same sensation a century ago. He was actually a very cool guy. He was unlike most of the explorers. He did not appear to be particularly appallingly colonial. He wasn't going there for glory, all of that, or because he was a second son who was not inheriting the father's estate. Instead, some woman spurned him and he said, that's it. I'm going to go to East Africa and explore. And once he got there, he appeared to be this very fun guy, enjoying himself, very open to cultural stuff, a certain joie de vivre that he had about him. And ultimately, all sorts of stuff was named for him. Thompson Gazelles, Thompson Falls in Kenya, which is now called by the original Kenyan name. And interestingly, also Limnotrochus thompsoni, which is an East African freshwater snail, which is what gave him schistosomiasis and killed him at age 37. Okay, so that was my shared call of the void with Joseph Thomson. But of course, at some point, you get around to saying, what's the cause of this? Where is this coming from? And there appears to be a bunch of psychological mechanisms going into it. One is it's the reason why you go to a scary movie, to contemplate the terrifying, to contemplate the unthinkable, and then have the, it's great when I stop hitting my head against the wall, relief when you back away from it and say, no, I'm not really going to jump off. And that's just up on a movie screen. Some of the time it's to try to have a sense of control. Oh my God, I'm feeling tempted to jump into this volcano, but look at how much I'm the captain of my own fate. I'm not going to do it. I didn't do it. A very nice way of explaining it I saw on one website was someone saying this urge to leap into the abyss. This urge is you toying with what the boundaries are of our existence. Now, this also taps into a body of research that was done a couple of decades back by this Harvard psychologist, Daniel Wegner, amazing scientist, died horrendously early in life of ALS. And in addition to his other work, he had this one famous paper that was published in Science in 2009 called How to Think, Say, or Do Precisely the Wrong Thing for Any Occasion. And what he analyzed was this pull, this urge of make sure I don't do that. And then you go and do it. You do the social equivalent of leaping into the volcano. And he describes circumstances where people go to a party and they say, remember, this person is going to be there and their spouse recently died. Remember, don't ask them about how their spouse is. And they come up to you and instantly say, how is, oh my God, how did I say the worst possible thing in that circumstance? And what he called this the imp of perversity, which was after an Edgar Allan Poe story. And what he identified was there were two components to this phenomenon, what would be called a two-factor model. The first one is you're going to this party and you file away the first fact, which is it is very, very, very important how I interact with this person about their spouse tonight. And the second one is the important thing is to not ask them how their spouse is. And what you get is if you're tired enough, if you're stressed enough, if you're anxious enough, whatever, the two parts dissociate. You remember there's something very, very important about them and their spouse. But at that point, it's basically a coin toss whether you don't mention their spouse or you say, so how is Bill these days? It reflects dissociating the this is important from what is important about this. Now, it turns out there's a couple of great quotes about call the void, and they're very stirring. One from Nietzsche, if you gaze long into the void will gaze into you. And I have no idea what he means by that. But another quote by, once again, get the Brooklyn French accent, Jean-Luc Godard, who said, he who jumps into the void owes no explanation to those who stand and merely watch, which sounds a lot like Coach and Survivor. So that's what this urge is about. It's well known enough that it's got a name. People have studied it. There's historical examples of it. It's really very charming. Now, just as an aside at the end here, for some reason, I decided to look to see if there were any books with the title Call of the Void. And it turns out there's like dozens of them, a huge number of them on Amazon, and they all appear to be written in the most purplish, over the top prose. I couldn't prevent myself. I had to write some of these down here. In one of the books, the description is Cassia has survived her brother's attempts to crush her and her growing army, but the battle for their empire is just beginning. It even makes mention of the elven court of Mareth. Another one, careening from the hardest edges of the city to the creepy rural backroads where cries go unheard. Then another one that's described as being a venue where old wounds may have to be torn open. Then another one, it wasn't long before he became the hamster on a wheel that runs but doesn't get anywhere. That also was described with one of the characters asking the other one, what's more exciting than being the first human to shoot an alien in the face? So there's just a whole bunch of these, including, of course, one book which is about the call of the void using a Ouija board to communicate with a loved one. So that has infiltrated its way into a whole bunch of schlock novels. And most importantly, this is something about half of people have, and it's real enough of a phenomenon that you can do science on it.
To wrap up today, Honor from Turkey asks, what makes it more or less likely that the members of a certain species will accept an orphan and raise it together with the rest of the brood/litter?
Well, while rare, it nonetheless is much more frequently happening than people used to think. Study animals long enough, various social species, and there's a good chance you will see somebody adopting some other infant. This has been seen in a bunch of primate species, marmoset monkeys, old world primates, macaques like bonnet macaques, rhesus monkeys, baboons, although I've never seen that. Chimps have shown adoption, bonobos have shown it as well. It actually comes in a number of forms. There's the one that sounds most logical, most obvious here, which is a mother dies and somebody takes over the raising of her infant, adoption in the usual sense. What's often instead grouped with this is somebody just decides to take somebody else's kid for a while and just hang out with them or steal them away from another female. And but in the purest form, there's definitely precedent in a lot of species where an animal will pick up an orphan from somebody else's death and raise the kid. And the important thing about it is trying to figure out who's most likely to be raised. Doesn't matter if it's a male or a female offspring. When you look collectively at the literature, very interestingly, though, at least in bonnet monkeys, what you see is if the mother who died, if the mother was high ranking, more of the folks remaining there are going to take part in raising her kid. What's this about? Somehow the shadow she still casts with her dominance is motivating to their behaviors. But what you mostly have to do when watching this is say, what's in it for the females who do it? By every rule there, this is maladaptive. You are expending energy on passing on copies of genes of somebody else's lineage, and it does cost. For example, you can show that when a female bonobo adopts somebody else's infant, the bonobo has to spend more time foraging because she does it less efficiently. She spends less time socializing. In one case, a bonobo with a nursing infant adopted another infant, interestingly from another group, adopted it and had both of them, nursed them both, and her child happened to die, and she continued to nurse the adopted kid into maturity. So you ask, why does this happen? What might explain any of these circumstances? And there's a number of models out there built around sort of some familiar themes in the evolution of behavior. First one, Kin selection. We've covered this. Organisms behave to maximize the number of copies of genes they leave in the next generation. And some of the time, you do it by helping your close relatives reproduce more. And it turns out about half the cases of adoption like this, it's a kin selection argument. It's your niece, it's your nephew, there's relatedness that comes into it. So that one makes a lot of sense. Then people speculate that this is a reciprocal altruism model. And somehow what this means is if I'm willing to take care of your kid after you die, are you willing to take care of my kid after I die? I don't quite get how it works. The most common explanation, though, is these tend to be young females who are the adopters who have not yet had a kid. And basically, they just got the hormones all over the place and they're just spilling over with non-specific scatter shots of maternalism. Probably the most interesting model, though, is the one that you adopt somebody else's kid, you adopt them in order to learn to be a better mother. And this is a fascinating feature about mother-infant interactions in primates. Mothering, everybody used to think it's the most natural thing on earth. Every species out there mothers instinctively, know how to mother competently, and that turns out not to be the case. And among non-human primates, it takes a lot of learning, it takes a lot of expertise, and one of the clearest ways of appreciating that is you look upon a whole group of monkeys. This was originally shown with rhesus monkeys. And the more kids a female has had, the greater the likelihood is that her new child is going to survive because she's gotten experience. New mothers are the ones who are most likely to mess up and drop the kid from out of a tree and stuff. So they accrue practice. And what this begins to explain is this phenomenon in a lot of primate species of anting behavior. You young female, go to your big sister who has a kid, a child, an infant, and you try to grab onto the kid and take care of the kid for a while. And what often happens is if it's a close relative, like your sister, she will in fact tolerate that. What's this about? She's not going to let you run off with the kid because you're not nursing, you're not competent, you're going to like mess up and kill the kid and cost her reproductive success. On the other hand, enhancing your maternal competence is going to increase her reproductive success by kin selection. Not to mention that when you've got the kid, she can go and forage or go to the movies or take a bath or a nap or something. So these are circumstances where the learning to mother is built around kin selection. A close relative, you let her learn a little bit about mothering off of your kid. When you've got an orphan unrelated from a different group, all the advantages of learning to mother are going to come to that female who hopefully now will be more likely for her first offspring to survive. And showing that, what is seen is if you're a young female and you got an older sister who has had kids, the odds of your first child surviving are better than if you don't have an older sister. Because you've watched her, you've anted the kid, you've learned all about it, observational learning and actual hands-on practice. So this may be one of the motivations for that as well. I saw one paper that had a very odd explanation for the motivation, and this was a chimp, atypically a male chimp, an adult male chimp, who had adopted an orphan chimp of somebody else. And what was this about? And it happened the infant was male. The author speculated that this was by raising this kid, you would eventually have this strapping young, studly male ally to watch your back. Presumably, if you adopt a female, that's just a horrible mistake because it doesn't really count. Now, what this transitions us to here now is not just cases of adopting somebody else's offspring, but adopting one from a different species, interspecies adoption. And that's been seen in about a dozen different pairings of species. For example, dolphins have been observed to adopt and raise and take care of orphaned whales. Capuchin monkeys will do the same for marmoset monkeys. In South America, at least one case of a lion adopting an orphaned leopard cub and raising it. Then one case, a three-fingered sloth who adopted an orphaned two-fingered sloth, which may actually just be about problems with counting. But you see it in a lot of bird species, and every now and then, rarely, you may even see it where you have a bird adopting a mammal, but rather rare. Now, the most famous example of an interspecies adoption was this famous case about 25 years ago. A young lioness in a national park in Kenya, a young lioness who took an interest in oryx. Oryx, these antelope thingies that lions like to hunt and eat. And what she developed was this obsessive need to go steal oryx babies from their mother. She shows up and there's this lion there, and the mother's not going to be able to do a whole lot if for some reason this crazy lion wants to pick up your kid and take it away and take care of this. This is like Lord Voldemort stealing your kid to cuddle them or give them ice skating lessons or something. But this lioness did this 5 times in the course of a year. And she meant it. She nuzzled with them. She kept them warm. She protected them from other lions. She showed at one juncture that she was willing to give up on a certain kill that was going to just be great and easy because, oh no, the oryx kid is beginning to wander off. So give up on the hunt and go get your oryx kid and bring him back. This was in the New York Times. This was oceans of tourists and tourist vehicles trying to catch her adopting, stealing somebody else's kid. This was a major news story for a while. What came of them? Well, two of the kids were removed by rangers and returned to the mothers because they're nursing. And this female lioness was not able to produce milk, let alone oryx milk. So that was the case in those. In one case, another male managed to get to the infant and kill it. One other case, I think nobody knew what happened, but a very irritating version of the fifth one, which is all these news accounts end by saying, but she eventually showed her lion nature, that even that could transcend this weirdo sentimental stuff she was doing. In one case, she wound up eating the kid. Oh my God, she went and killed the kid. No, when you read closely, the oryx died of dehydration because it couldn't nurse. And in the aftermath, the lioness did what she would do with dead lion cubs, which is she ate the carcass. Okay, so that's a whole realm where you're seeing adoption between species. Again, very, very rare. And more so, when you see it within species, it comes with certain parameters. It's not cheap for the adult adopting the kid. There's a big price to be paid, and people are still trying to figure out the benefits of it, other than maybe this non-specific, gauzy response to just babies who are so cute. All you want to do is raise them. Lots of this goes on in mammals as well.
And that's it. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.